The war ended on a Tuesday. That is what the conclave called it, an ending. 17 species signed the ceasefire accord at Vareth Station. The Krethdi Dominion stood down. The Outer Rim Collective withdrew its siege fleets. The disputed corridor between systems Lev 4 and Lev 9 was divided, carved up, handed out like portions of something already dead. 12 billion casualties. 400 years of intermittent conflict. And, now, silence. We were not celebrating. You do not celebrate after 12 billion dead. You simply stop. I was there. Fleet Secondary Trelevas of the Bahari Concordat, attached to the Joint Ceasefire Monitoring Committee. I had a desk, a terminal, a stack of casualty reports I had stopped reading somewhere around the 300 million mark because the numbers had ceased to carry meaning and had become simply weight. I was also, and I say this not as confession but, as context, a bureaucrat. I am good at bureaucracy. I count things. I file things. I notice discrepancies in manifests that other officers overlook. It is not a glamorous skill set. It kept me alive through a war that killed more glamorous officers than I can count. So I was at my desk on what the conclave called the first morning of peace when the transmission came through from the Lev 9 monitoring outpost. Not an attack. Not a ceasefire violation. A request. The humans wanted to know politely, in that flat, slightly too calm way that I would come to associate with humans who had already decided what they were going to do and were merely informing you as a courtesy whether the ceasefire applied to them. I remember setting down my intake report. I remember the specific quality of the silence in the monitoring room. I remember my colleague Drethian, who was Krethdi by species and, therefore technically my enemy until roughly 6 standard hours prior, turning to look at me with all 4 of his ocular clusters fully dilated, which, in Krethdi physiology, is the expression of a being who has just been told something that rearranges their understanding of a situation. The humans had not been part of the war. Officially. Technically. On paper. I pulled up their file. It took longer than it should have, because their entry in the conclave's species registry was sparse. Class of contact, peripheral. Threat assessment, negligible. Engagement history, minimal. Observer status, inactive. The humans had been, according to every official document I had access to, sitting this one out. I started cross-referencing. I am a bureaucrat. I cross-reference. What I found, over the next 4 hours, while the rest of the monitoring stations celebrated the ceasefire with whatever their species used to mark the end of mass death, I found the thing that kept me awake for the next 6 months, that cost me 2 promotions I was otherwise certain of, and that ultimately resulted in my reassignment to a research posting in the outer reach that everyone assured me was not a punishment while very clearly being a punishment. The humans had not been sitting this out. They had been in it from nearly the beginning. They had simply made sure no one noticed. This is the account I filed. This is what I found. I am releasing it now because the ceasefire is holding, barely, and because some of what I uncovered has started showing up in other reports, from other monitoring stations, from other wars I was not assigned to, and I think it is time that the conclave understood what was actually sharing the galaxy with them. I have been a bureaucrat my entire career. I count things. And, the things I counted, in those reports, in those casualty logs, in the 17 separate engagements where no human vessel was officially recorded present, those numbers do not behave the way numbers are supposed to behave. They told a different story. They told a human story. I think you should hear it. Fleet Secondary Trelevas, Bahari Concordat Monitoring Division, Personal Log, appended to Official Report VHC 7741 Moen Classification. I tried. They overruled me. Read it anyway. The first anomaly was a casualty report from the 3rd Lev Corridor engagement. I want to be precise about this, because precision is what I do, and because what I am about to describe requires that the reader understand exactly how unremarkable it appeared at first. A casualty report. 17 pages. Filed by Sector Commander Vasari of the Outer Rim Collective, dated 4 cycles before the ceasefire. Standard format. Engagement summary, equipment loss, personnel status by unit, ammunition expenditure, tactical outcome. The tactical outcome column read, inconclusive. That was unusual. The third Lev corridor had been, by all accounts, a decisive collective victory. The Krethdi flanking force had been broken. The corridor access point had been held. I had a separate report from Krethdi Command that listed the same engagement as a significant strategic loss. Both reports were consistent on those facts. What they were not consistent on was the breakdown of their own losses. The collective's report listed 37 destroyed vessels. The Krethdi report, which tallied its enemy losses with the kind of precision that only comes from a species that considers accurate record-keeping a form of psychological self-defense, listed 42 destroyed collective vessels. 5 vessels unaccounted for. Across 17 pages of meticulous documentation, 5 vessels had simply not been reported. I am a bureaucrat. I notice this kind of thing the way some species notice changes in air pressure before a storm. It is not intelligence, exactly. It is more like a specific shape of obsessiveness. I went back through the tactical logs for the engagement. I cross-referenced the transponder records. I pulled the debris field survey from the post-engagement environmental scan. The debris field contained fragments from 42 destroyed vessels. But only 37 transponder codes. The other 5 had been broadcasting, right up until they weren't. Then, nothing. No emergency beacon. No distress signal. No last transmission. Not even the kind of static scatter you get when a power core vents catastrophically. They had simply stopped. I filed a discrepancy note. Standard procedure. I assumed it was a transponder calibration error, or a recording gap, or the kind of minor inconsistency that happens when 17 different species are all operating in the same combat zone with 17 different communication protocols and nobody's software quite speaks to anyone else's software. I moved on to the next report. The next report was from Engagement 7 of the Outer Rim Siege, the assault on Collective Resupply Station Harath 6. Much larger engagement. 40 pages. 312 Krethdi assault vessels against a collective defensive fleet of, I stopped counting at 200 because the numbers got complex, and a fortified station that had held against 2 previous assault attempts. This time, the station fell. The Krethdi report was thorough. They always were. The Krethdi have a cultural conviction that the quality of your record-keeping reflects the quality of your military thinking, which means their battle logs read like something between a tactical manual and a religious text. Step by step. Timeline synchronized to 6 decimal places of their standard time unit, which I did not have a conversion table for but, which my terminal estimated at roughly half a standard second. The station fell in the 7th wave of the assault. The defensive fleet broke at the point where Collective Carrier Group 4 lost cohesion following the destruction of its command vessel. Standard collapse pattern. Predictable. I had seen the same sequence dozens of times in the data. What I had not seen before was the note on page 31. Anomalous behavioral observation flagged for further review by Tactical Intelligence Subdirectorate. The note described an incident during the 6th wave, approximately 40 minutes before the station fell. The Krethdi assault force had been held up by a collective defensive formation at the station's primary docking arm. The formation was strong. Disciplined. The kind of defense that could hold indefinitely if resupply reached it in time. It did not hold. It broke not from the front, where the Krethdi were pressing, but from behind. Something had come through the station's secondary maintenance corridor, bypassed 3 security bulkheads that the Krethdi assault teams had been unable to breach in 6 previous attempts, and hit the defensive formation in its most vulnerable point at the precise moment the Krethdi 6th wave committed to its push. The timing was, according to the Krethdi tactical analysis, statistically implausible as coincidence. The note went on. The Krethdi investigators had reviewed the station's internal security footage. Most of it had been destroyed. Standard data denial protocol: when a military installation falls, you wipe what you can before the enemy gets in. But 3 camera segments had survived, in the kind of corrupted, partial, infuriating state that makes security footage useful mostly as evidence that something happened, not what. The first segment showed an empty corridor. Then, a bulkhead door, rated for pressure differential up to 15 standard atmospheres, being opened from the wrong side without the access codes. Not cut. Not blown. Opened. As in, the mechanism had been physically manipulated by something that understood how it worked well enough to work around it. The second segment showed, and I read this 3 times to make sure I was parsing the translation correctly, a single figure, in what the Krefft-I analysts described as primitive pressure-capable body armor with improvised modifications, moving through the defensive formation staging area. Not fighting. Not running. Moving with what the analysts described, in a phrase that I found genuinely unsettling, as deliberate environmental familiarity, as if the person moving through an active military station during an assault had simply decided where they needed to be and gone there without consulting anyone's threat assessment. The third segment was 43 seconds of an empty corridor and, then, a small, flat, rectangular object sitting against a wall. 11 minutes after that object appeared in frame, the defensive formation broke. The Krefft-I analysts had flagged the incident under undetermined actor, possible collective black asset. They had not, as far as the report indicated, pursued the investigation further. They won the engagement. The station fell. There were other things to do. I filed a second discrepancy note, cross-referenced the first, and kept reading. By the time I had been at my desk for 6 hours on the morning of the ceasefire, I had found 11 anomalies across 14 separate engagement reports. They were not all the same shape. That was what kept me reading. They were not repetitive enough to be a system error, not consistent enough to be a single actor, and not explicable enough to be anything I had a category for. A resupply convoy in the outer rim that had been ambushed and destroyed, which the collective claimed credit for but whose tactical execution bore absolutely no resemblance to any collective operational signature in my database. A Krefft-I communications blackout during the second phase of the LEV-4 orbital engagement that lasted 47 minutes, long enough to completely disrupt their coordination, attributed to solar interference, except that the stellar activity logs showed nothing. A medical evacuation vessel from a minor neutral station that had somehow navigated through an active combat zone spanning 6 systems without being intercepted by either side, carrying 1,100 wounded from both factions, which was remarkable enough that I read the passage twice and, then, checked the date to make sure it wasn't a fiction entry that had gotten misfiled. The medical vessel was real. Its transponder code was registered to, I pulled up the registry, a human freight cooperative based out of a mid-tier colony station in the periphery. I sat with that for a moment. The Bahari Concordat, my own people, had a word, Velthris, for the feeling of a pattern becoming visible. It is not quite the same as the concept most species would translate as realization. It is more specific than that. It means the sensation of a thing you were looking at directly, that you did not see, becoming visible without having moved. The pattern was there before. It is still there now. You simply see it. Velthris. I pulled every engagement report I had access to for the last 43 months of the war. That was the full extent of my committee clearance. I built a secondary index, sorted by anomaly type, and started mapping against timeline. I want to tell you that I found something clean. A neat pattern. A revelation that assembled itself elegantly. That is not what happened. What I found was messier than that, and, in some ways more unsettling, because of how mundane most of it was. Individually, each anomaly was explainable. A clerical error here. An equipment glitch there. A tactical outcome that was unusual but not impossible. A piece of timing that stretched probability but didn't break it. Together they told a story. 43 months. Hundreds of engagements. And, threaded through all of it, appearing in the gaps where the official record had small, quiet silences, a presence. Not a fleet. Not a declared force. Not a species with a seat at the ceasefire table. Something that had been helping both sides. Selectively. My terminal chimed. Drathian leaned over from his station. He had been watching me for the past hour with the particular quality of attention that Krefft-I give to things they find suspicious, which involved a slight forward lean and 2 of his 4 ocular clusters tracking independently, one on me, one on my screen. "You are not filing," he said. I am thinking. Those are different activities. Yes. I pulled up the medical vessel entry again. Drathian. The Lev 9 convoy. The one that hit your third resupply line in the 41st month. Your report listed it as a collective operation. His posture shifted. Something in the Krethdi bearing that I had learned, over 6 hours of shared crisis, to read is careful. That is what the report says. Did you actually recover any collective hardware from the convoy raiders? Silence. It was a specific kind of silence. Not ignorance. Not confusion. The silence of a very intelligent person deciding how much to say. The engagement was fast, he said finally. The raiders were gone before the response team arrived. We made assumptions based on tactical signature? Proximity. I looked at him. They were in collective territory, he said. We assumed. I turned back to my screen. The collective made 3 separate allegations in the 92nd month that someone was running interdiction operations against their supply lines in the Lev 4 shadow zone. They accused you. We did not have assets in the Lev 4 shadow zone in the 92nd month. We were committed at Harath. I know. Another silence. Then, who, I don't know yet. I added his information to my index. But, I'm noticing a pattern. Something was in this war that didn't sign the ceasefire. Something that both sides were hitting each other with the credit for. Drathian was quiet for a long moment. His 4 ocular clusters did the thing where they all focused on a single point, me, which in Krethdi psychology indicated the kind of focused, undivided attention they reserved for things they considered threats or puzzles. He had been treating me as a minor filing obstacle since I arrived at the monitoring station 6 hours ago. Something in his demeanor shifted. The humans sent a transmission, he said. I know. Asking if the ceasefire applied to them. That is an odd thing to ask. It is an extremely odd thing to ask, I agreed. If you weren't involved, you don't need to ask. You simply observe. He said nothing. If you were involved, I continued, but nobody knows you were involved. Asking that question is how you find out whether you've been caught. The monitoring room was very quiet. The ceasefire celebration sounds from the mess hall down the corridor felt very far away. Or, Drathian said slowly, it is how you announce yourself. I sent a query to the Lev 9 monitoring outpost requesting clarification on the human transmission. Who had sent it? From what vessel? With what authorization? The reply came back in 40 minutes. The transmission had originated from a human cargo hauler registered to the same freight cooperative as the medical evacuation vessel I'd found earlier. It was currently docked at the Lev 9 secondary depot, which was nominally neutral territory and had been used throughout the war as an informal exchange point for prisoner transfers and humanitarian aid. The human who had sent the transmission was identified in the outpost's visitor registry as a supply logistics coordinator. Name, Okafor, Ake rank, civilian contractor. Purpose of visit, cargo manifest reconciliation. I read that 3 times. Cargo manifest reconciliation. I pulled the Lev 9 secondary depot's arrival and departure logs for the past 43 months. Okafor, it had been there 11 times. 11 times. Across the entire duration of the war, this civilian cargo logistics coordinator had passed through a depot in a contested system on the border of active combat operations 11 times. The stated purpose of each visit was the same, cargo manifest reconciliation. I looked at the dates of each visit. Then, I looked at my anomaly index. The dates did not match exactly. But, they were close. Within a week of each visit, there was at least 1 entry in my anomaly index. Sometimes 2. I was aware, sitting at that desk, of my scent glands doing something involuntary. Bahari stress response, a faint metallic emission that our own species can't smell but that most others find unpleasant. Drathian wrinkled something that served as his olfactory organ and shifted slightly away from me. I did not apologize. I was too busy. I cross-referenced the cargo manifests. This was where it got strange in a different way, a smaller way, the way that is almost worse than the large strangeness because it is the kind of detail you cannot explain away. The manifests were accurate. I pulled the cargo inspection records from 11 different outpost transits. Every item listed. Every weight, every volume, every container designation. The inspectors had been thorough. In a war zone, you inspect cargo from neutral parties very carefully. Nothing had been flagged. Nothing had been found. The cargo was always legitimate. Aid supplies. Medical equipment. Food synthesizer components. The kind of cargo that moved through humanitarian corridors and that inspection teams passed because the war, for all its brutality, had maintained a grudging consensus that aid traffic should move. But in every single manifest, there was a line item for what the documentation described as calibration equipment, navigational instruments. Variable in quantity. Small. The kind of notation that a trained inspector looks at and thinks surveying gear, boring, next. I am not a trained inspector. I am a bureaucrat who cross-references. The total listed weight of calibration equipment, navigational instruments across 11 transits was, I did the arithmetic twice, approximately 460 kilograms. I looked up the weight of a standard portable communications relay with encrypted burst transmission capability. Approximately 40 kilograms. 11 times 40 kilograms. 440 kilograms. Give or take 20 kilograms for whatever navigational instruments were in there. 11 relays. In 11 contested or conflict-adjacent locations. Across 43 months of a war that this human was not officially part of. I sat back in my chair. My scent glands were not calming down. Drathian. He looked up. In your records, the Krethdi intelligence files you have access to on this station, I am not going to share classified Dominion intelligence with a Concordat monitoring officer. We signed a ceasefire 6 hours ago. That does not make it your intelligence. I considered my next words carefully. Bahari are not natural diplomats. We tend to communicate in the manner of people updating a database, which other species find either efficient or cold depending on the context. But I had 43 months of anomaly data and a civilian logistics coordinator who had been threading encrypted communications relays into the bones of a war nobody asked them to join, and I needed to know how deep this went. What I'm looking at, I said, may be relevant to the stability of the ceasefire. Drathian's ocular clusters focused. What I'm looking at may also be something both our governments would prefer to understand before it does something else. Silence. The humans asked if the ceasefire applied to them, I said. Neither of us knows what they were actually doing for the past 43 months. If they were running intelligence operations, or logistics support, or interdiction, we don't know whose side they were on. We don't know what they know. We don't know what leverage they might have. More silence. And we're about to have them sitting at a neutral depot, I finished, while everyone else is celebrating and not paying attention. Drathian uncrossed 4 of his 6 limbs and turned to his own terminal. I will share what is not classified. That's all I'm asking. What we found, over the next 3 hours, building the index together in a monitoring room while the rest of the station's mixed crew from 17 species drank their various celebratory beverages and told each other that the war was finally over, was not what I had expected. I had expected evidence of manipulation. Of a small species playing both sides, extracting profit or intelligence from a conflict too big for them to fight openly. What the combined data showed was something else. Every interdiction operation that matched the anomaly profile had targeted supply lines. Specifically, and this is the detail that stopped both of us, specifically supply lines that fed the most intensive ground combat operations. The ones with the highest civilian casualty rates. The medical evacuation vessel had operated throughout its 11-month active period in contested zones where the Conclave's official aid framework didn't reach. It had moved wounded from both sides. Equally. Without apparent preference. The communications relays, if that's what they were, had been placed in positions that would have given someone extremely good real-time intelligence on the movement of both major fleets. But none of that intelligence appeared to have been sold. neither side had shown unexpected foreknowledge of the other's movements. Whatever was being done with that information, it was not being given to either Krethdi Command or the collective Strategic Directorate. They were watching, Drathayan said. He said it the way you say something you are still deciding whether you believe. For 43 months. And, the interdiction operations were surgical. Every single one. No civilian infrastructure touched. No aid corridors disrupted. Every target was military supply chain, and, specifically the supply nodes that fed the 3 engagements with the worst groundside atrocity records. Drathayan was quiet for a long time. The Harath prison camp transports, he said finally. Very quietly. I checked my index. The convoy disruption in month 38. Which your intelligence attributed to the collective. We arrested 40 collective intelligence officers over that disruption. I said nothing. They were not responsible, he said. It was not a question. No. Something happened in Drathayan's physiognomy that I did not have a reference for. The Krethdi have 47 distinct configurations of their ocular clusters, each with documented psychological correlates, and I had learned 6 of them in the past 6 hours. This was none of the 6. The camps, he said, were disrupted. Supply convoys diverted. The program slowed significantly after month 38. I paused. Your own records show casualty rates from the holding facilities dropped by 60% in the 8 months following that convoy disruption. The monitoring room was very quiet. Someone did that, I said. And, then, let you arrest 40 collective officers for it and, said nothing. Outside, in the mess hall, someone was laughing. Some species version of celebration. I did not know which species. It sounded distant and strange. Why would they do that, Drathayan said, and it was not a question either. It was the sound of a very intelligent being arriving at the edge of something they did not know how to categorize. I had been asking myself the same thing for 3 hours. I had the anomaly data. I had the timelines. I had the manifest records, the relay weights, the casualty correlations, the medical vessel's route log showing it moving between both sides wounded with absolute, seamless impartiality. I did not have an answer to why. They asked if the ceasefire applied to them, I said. Yes. And, neither of us knows what they'd do if the answer was no. Drathayan turned back to his terminal. His secondary limbs, the ones Krethdi use for fine manipulation, were doing something, tapping, I realized. A rapid, irregular rhythm against the console edge. I had not seen him do that before. I think, he said slowly, we should go and talk to the logistics coordinator at Lev 9. I think so too. I think we should go before our respective governments are briefed. I looked at him. Because once they are briefed, he said, whatever happens next will be political. And, I would like to understand what actually happened before it becomes political. This was, I reflected, the most reasonable thing a Krethdi officer had said to me in the entire 6 hours since we had technically stopped being on opposite sides of a war. I saved my index. Encrypted it. Filed a transit request to Lev 9 under Routine Monitoring Committee Inspection Authority, which nobody would question because nobody was paying attention, because the war was over and everyone was celebrating. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like a very specific kind of Vihari, the kind who has just seen the pattern that was there the whole time, right in front of them, and cannot stop seeing it. Vel Thris. The war was over. The humans had not signed the ceasefire. And, somewhere at Lev 9 Secondary Depot, a civilian logistics coordinator named Okafor was reconciling a cargo manifest and waiting to find out whether anyone had noticed. Someone had noticed. We were on our way. The transit from the monitoring station to Lev 9 Secondary Depot took 11 hours aboard a Concordat inspection shuttle, which was not a comfortable vessel under any circumstances and was made significantly less comfortable by the fact that I was sharing it with a Krethdi intelligence officer who spent the first 4 hours of the journey reading through everything I had indexed, saying nothing, and eating something from a ration pack that produced a smell I will not describe except to note that my scent glands responded to it as though to a threat. By hour 5, Drathian had stopped eating. He was staring at his screen with all 4 ocular clusters locked in the configuration I had tentatively classified as deep, uncomfortable processing. "The relay placements," he said. "Yes. 3 of them are in positions that would have had direct line of passive scan to Dominion command fleet positioning during the LEV 4 phase." "Yes. That intelligence was never used against us." "No. But they had it. They had it for the entire LEV 4 phase. 18 months. His secondary limbs resumed their tapping rhythm. Faster, now. I had begun to understand that the tapping was the Kreth-Dai equivalent of what I did with my scent glands when I couldn't process something, an involuntary expression of cognitive overload that the species in question was probably not aware they were doing. "Why?" he said. "I don't know." "What possible?" He stopped. "Tried again. If they had that positioning data, they could have sold it to the collective for I cannot calculate what the collective would have paid. The war turns on fleet positioning. They had our fleet positioning for 18 months and they sold it to no one." "Correct. So they were not mercenary." "It doesn't look like it. And they were not ideological. They did not pick a side. Not in any way I can identify. And they disrupted the worst atrocities from both sides. Not one side's atrocities. Both." "Yes." He was quiet for a while. "What kind of species," he said, "does that?" I had no answer for him. I had been sitting with that question for 11 hours, and the closest I had come to anything useful was a notation I had found buried in an old Concordat xenological assessment of humanity filed about 60 years prior, updated infrequently, and clearly written by someone who had never expected it to be relevant to anything, that described humans as exhibiting anomalously strong cross-group empathic responses uncorrelated with genetic proximity or reciprocal alliance obligations. Which was the academic way of saying, they cared about beings they had no reason to care about. I was still deciding what to do with that. LEV 9 Secondary Depot was exactly what its name suggested, secondary. It existed in the shadow of the larger primary installation 3 light hours away, and its whole function, through the war and before it, had been to handle the overflow traffic that the primary couldn't manage. Humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, the irregular cargo traffic that a war zone generates at its fringes. It had been shelled twice, never seriously, and wore its damage with the weary resignation of infrastructure that has survived by being too unglamorous to fully destroy. The docking bay where the human vessel was registered was on the depot's 4th ring. Our inspection shuttle came in on the 3rd and we walked the rest of the way, which gave me time to observe the depot's population. Mixed species. Mostly neutral parties, the kind of beings who make their living in the marginal spaces of conflicts they're not part of. Aid workers. Freight brokers. The handful of journalists who hadn't already filed their ceasefire-is-signed stories and gone home. A few collective personnel still processing the paperwork for the ceasefire's first phase. A few Kreth-Dai who looked, I thought, the way Drathian had looked approximately 8 hours ago, before he'd read the index. The human vessel was a mid-size cargo hauler. Not military. Not even paramilitary. The hull had been repainted at least 4 times in recent years and the current coat was a shade of off-white that had clearly been chosen for its ability to look unremarkable rather than for any aesthetic reason. The vessel's name was stenciled in standard along the bow in letters that someone had repainted slightly more recently than the hull, second consideration. I found that name interesting. I did not immediately know why. There was a human standing outside the docking collar, running a diagnostic on something small and electronic. HFY pronoun approximation, I had the xenological briefings, was not what I had imagined from 11 months of cross-referencing manifests and casualty reports. She was average height for a human, which is slightly shorter than average Vahari. Work-worn clothes. No visible insignia. She had what I understood to be the human characteristic of appearing younger than she was, which is a biological quirk of their species that I found consistently difficult to recalibrate for. She was, by the body language standards of roughly 12 species I had interacted with, completely relaxed. A being who was completely relaxed at a neutral depot on the first day of a ceasefire, having spent 43 months doing what my index said she had been doing, was either genuinely calm or the most precisely controlled performer I had ever encountered. I did not yet know which. She looked up when we were 10 meters away. Looked at me. Looked at Drathian. Registered the combination Concordat monitoring insignia on my jacket, Krethdi intelligence rank markers on his, and did something with her face that I had not seen a face do in response to us. It was not alarm. It was not the calculation I had expected, the rapid assessment of threat and response that any sensible being performs when two officials from opposing sides of a war approach them together. It was, as far as I could interpret human facial expression at that range, something between amusement and the look of someone who has been expecting a bus for a very long time and has just seen it coming around the corner. Okafor? I said. That's me. She tucked the diagnostic tool into a pocket that seemed to contain at least 4 other tools. You two got here faster than I expected. I figured someone would come, but I thought maybe a week. 2 weeks? People are usually still celebrating. I noted my scent glands. I noted them deliberately, because this is the kind of notation that keeps me from reacting in ways I will have to explain later. Scent gland activity, slight. Cause, unexpected frankness. You were expecting us, Drathian said. It was technically a question. He said it the way Krethdi say questions they already know the answers to. I was expecting someone. She glanced at the second consideration and, then, back at us. Do you want to do this out here, or do you want to come inside? I've got something warm if you drink warm things. One of you probably does. Drathian and I exchanged a look that crossed the species barrier with unusual clarity. We went inside. The interior of the second consideration looked nothing like a military vessel and everything like a working ship operated by someone who spent most of their life in it. The narrow corridor from the docking collar to the main cabin was lined with equipment lockers, all of them labeled in a mixture of standard and a script I identified as one of the human written languages but couldn't read. The main cabin had a fold-out table, for seats that had seen extensive use, a small galley unit, and, on one wall, a display board covered in what appeared to be a handwritten network map of the kind I had been building on my terminal for the past 16 hours, except this one was larger, more detailed, and had been there long enough that some of the notations had faded. I stood in front of it for a moment. Drathian made a sound that his species produces when they want to indicate that they are profoundly bothered by something but are choosing to remain composed. A low, resonant click from a secondary respiratory structure. I had heard it twice before in the past 6 hours. Okafor was already at the galley unit. She produced 2 containers, one with something warm and amber-colored, one with something cold and opaque, and set them on the table. Sit, she said. Or stand. Whichever. You look like you've been at this a while. You sent that transmission this morning, I said. To the monitoring outpost. Asking about the ceasefire. Yes. Why? She turned. Leaned against the galley unit. Looked at me with the specific quality of attention that I had, in my experience, seen mostly in beings who have spent a very long time being very careful and are now deciding whether to stop. Because the ceasefire is real. And the war is actually over. And I thought, if someone is going to find out, it should be now, when it's stable, rather than in 6 months when something in the manifests gives it away and it becomes a thing that looks like it was hidden. It was hidden, Drathian said. It was quiet, she said. There's a difference. You would like to explain the difference? Not particularly. She sat down. But I'll answer what you actually want to know. She said it the way someone says things they have rehearsed, not because the rehearsal made the words easier, but because they had decided, at some point, that the answer deserved to be given cleanly, without fumbling. I sat down. After a moment, Drathian did too. Start, I said, with the relays. The relays were hers. 11 of them, yes, and I had the weight calculation approximately right. She seemed faintly amused that I had run it. The placement was deliberate, the positions chosen over the first 8 months of the war after she and a group of others, she described it as a group and, I noted the plural carefully, had spent the pre-war period mapping the likely conflict escalation patterns and identifying the corridor access points most likely to become active supply routes. We weren't watching the fleets, she said. We were watching the supply lines. For what purpose? So we knew where the worst of it was going to be. Where to send the medical runs. Where the civilian evacuation corridors needed to open before they got cut off. Where the prisoner exchanges needed to happen before the holding facilities got too. She paused. Made a small, contained movement with one hand that I catalogued as deliberate restraint. Before the situations in the holding facilities deteriorated past a certain point. Drathian's secondary limbs went still. The Harath transports, I said. Month 38, yes. She looked at her hands briefly. That one took longer than we wanted it to. The supply chain it had more redundancy than we'd anticipated. It took 3 separate disruptions before the operational tempo dropped enough to matter. 3, Drathian said. 3. You only attributed one of them to the collective. The other 2 went unattributed. A silence. You allowed us to arrest 40 collective officers, Drathian said. We didn't allow anything. We didn't cause it. We didn't tell you to do that. She met his ocular clusters directly, something I had learned that many species found uncomfortable when dealing with Kreth-Dai, because the four-eyed focused attention was designed, evolutionarily, as a predation posture, and other species' nervous systems registered it accordingly. Okafor looked at him like she was making eye contact, which was a thing humans did as a social signal rather than a threat display, and, the resulting combination of inputs, her body language reading his friendly engagement while his was reading his focused threat assessment, created an interaction I did not have a framework for. We were sorry about that. But, we weren't in a position to correct it without revealing ourselves, and, revealing ourselves at that point would have ended the operation entirely. You were sorry, Drathian said. 40 people spent 3 to 7 months in detention for something they didn't do. Her voice had gone flat in the specific way that human voices go flat when the speaker is working to keep them that way. We were tracking the process. We pushed for the evidence review through back channels. 12 of them were released inside 2 months. The rest took longer. We know. I looked at the display board on the wall. Up close, I could see that it was not just a network map. It had a secondary layer, a timeline, running vertically, with notations in the human script at intervals. It was the kind of record a person keeps not for an organization but for themselves. Not a report. A reckoning. The medical vessel, I said. She nodded. That's a different team. 12 operators, rotating shifts. They were independent, I coordinated with them on corridor access but, they ran their own operation. Their count was, she stopped. Recalculated something, visibly. Somewhere around 19,000 wounded moved from active combat zones. Both sides. Roughly equal in the aggregate, though it varied by phase. Drathian was doing the tapping again. Both sets of secondary limbs now. 19,000, I said. 19,340, last figure I had. That's several months out of date. The number sat on the table between us and did not get smaller. I was trying to construct a framework for this, the way I construct frameworks for all incoming data, by finding the category it belongs to. Espionage has a category. Mercenary activity has a category. Ideological intervention has a category. I had seen it twice in my career. Species who inserted themselves into conflicts because they believed in one side's cause. This did not fit any of those categories. The intelligence gathering had not been sold or shared with either side. The interventions had not favored either side. The resources expended, the fuel costs alone for 11 humanitarian transits, for a medical operation running for 11 months through an active war zone, were enormous relative to any evident return. And, the people doing it had stayed quiet. For 43 months. Why, I said. She looked at me. Not the operational reasoning. Not the corridor access, the supply chain analysis. Why? I paused. It was not my habit to ask questions I could not define precisely, but I did not know how to define this one more precisely. Why do this at all? You had no alliance obligation. No treaty. No territorial stake. The war was not approaching human space. You could not have extracted enough intelligence value to offset the operational cost. You lost how many people? Her expression changed. Settled into something that was not flat but was very still. 7. Over the full period. 3 to Dominion interdiction, 2 to collective security sweeps, they thought they were Dominion assets, and 2 to accidents. The work is dangerous. 7 people. Yes. And the war was not yours. She looked at her hands again. The way a person looks at something they've looked at before, in the same situation, trying to find a different answer. How many people did you lose? She asked. Not aggressively. The way someone asks when they need the other person to hold the number 2. I had the figure. I had been living in casualty reports for 16 hours. The Concordats aligned casualties over 43 months were. I don't mean the Concordat. I mean you. How many people did you know? I stopped. This was not a question I had been asked before, in this context. In most of the frameworks I operated within, monitoring committee work, interspecies liaison, bureaucratic assessment, the question of personal loss was a conflict of interest disclosure, a variable to be accounted for and set aside. You declared it. You moved on. You did not. You were not asked to hold it in the middle of a conversation about why someone had spent 43 months running covert humanitarian operations through a war that was not their business. 11, I said, eventually. From my cohort. Before the ceasefire. 11. She said it the way she had said 7. Like a weight that was being acknowledged, not transferred. I'm sorry. I noted my scent plans. They were doing something I did not recognize as a stress response. I noted that I did not have a category for the thing they were doing. The war was not your business, I said again. Trying to get back to the logic of it. No, she agreed. You chose to enter it anyway. Yes. And lose 7 people. Yes. And spend resources, time, operational risk, significant capital over 43 months. Yes. For beings you had never met. With no prospect of return. She was quiet for a moment. Not evading. Thinking, genuinely, about how to answer something that the answer to was probably very simple from her perspective and was not simple from mine. There's a conversation I had once, she said, with my grandfather. He was very old. He'd been through something when he was young. Not this war. An older one. A human one. She paused. He told me that the thing he regretted wasn't the things he did. It was the things he saw being done and walked away from. The weight of that. What you carry, for the rest of your life, when you had the capability and you chose not to use it. She looked at the display board. We had the capability, she said. We had the relays, the contacts, the route knowledge. We were already in those corridors. We'd been running freight through contested space for 20 years before the war started. We weren't soldiers. We were people who knew the roads. And the roads went through a war. She looked back at us. So we used the roads. Drathian had stopped tapping. He was looking at the display board with the ocular configuration I had seen earlier, the one I did not have a reference for. The one that had appeared when he said the Harath prison camp transports in a voice that had been doing something complicated. The 40 collective officers, he said. Yes. You tracked the review process. Yes. You pushed for the evidence reconsideration through back channels. Yes. What channels we had, which wasn't many, and it wasn't fast enough. Those officers, the ones who weren't released inside 2 months, we know their names, she said quietly. All of them. Drathian was quiet for a very long time. The Dominion, he said, eventually, would consider what you did to the Harrath transports an act of interference in a sovereign military operation. I know. It caused significant logistical disruption to the Dominion's 3rd Ground Army for approximately 11 months. Yes. Officially, the Dominion's position would be that this constituted, depending on how it was characterized, espionage, sabotage, or hostile action. I know. Is that the Dominion's position? Silence. Drathian looked at me. His 4 ocular clusters did the thing again, the configuration I had no reference for. I looked back at him. I was trying to find the category for what was happening in this cabin on a second-hand human cargo hauler at a tertiary depot at the edge of a war zone. What do you need from us? I said. Okafor looked at me with an expression that I had, over the past hour, begun to be able to read. It was the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations, not because the situation had changed but because the situation had turned out slightly better than they had allowed themselves to plan for. Nothing, right now, she said. The operation is over. The war is over. The relays are dark. The medical team is standing down. A pause. I need to know whether we're going to have a problem. Whether the ceasefire document, when it's finalized, is going to have a clause in it that makes what we did retrospectively an incident that someone has to respond to politically. I looked at Drathian. He looked at me. I thought about 40 collective officers in detention. About a casualty rate that dropped 60%. About 19,340 wounded moved through active combat zones. I thought about the way Drathian had said the Harrath prison camp transports in the voice that was doing something complicated. I need to see your full operational record, I said. Everything. The relay logs. The medical team's records. The interdiction timelines. The full accounting. That's a lot of data. I know. I'll need time to process it. I paused. I'm good at processing data. She looked at me with the expression again. Then, for the first time since we had come aboard, she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, the kind that has a lot of things behind it. I noticed, she said. The question of whether the ceasefire document will contain anything retrospective, I said, will depend on how the information is characterized in the Monitoring Committee's preliminary report. Which I write. I was aware that I was saying something that a more cautious Vahari administrator would not say. I was also aware that I had been awake for approximately 22 hours, that I had found 11 anomalies that turned out to be the surface layer of something I still did not fully understand, and that the being sitting across from me had spent 43 months doing something that I had no framework for, and that I was not sure I had been wrong, my entire life, to believe was not something that happened. I write the preliminary report, I said. How it is characterized matters. Okafor looked at Drathian. Drathian's secondary limbs were very still. The Dominion, he said slowly, also files preliminary assessments to the ceasefire monitoring framework. A pause that was measured in the way that only very careful beings measure their pauses. What is or is not in those assessments shapes what becomes an incident and what becomes a footnote. Another silence. You'd need the full record, Okafor said. Yes, I said. All of it. The things that could be characterized badly as easily as well. Yes. You'd be taking it on trust that the characterization would be, I cross-reference, I said. I don't mischaracterize data. It is professionally offensive to me. She looked at me for a long moment. Then, she nodded. I'll transfer the archive, she said. Give me an hour. While she prepared the transfer, Drathian and I stood in the corridor outside the main cabin. We said nothing for several minutes. This was fine. Bahari and Krethdi have comparable tolerances for productive silence. 19,000, Drathian said, eventually. Yes. 7 dead. Yes. The Harrath transports. I did not answer because it was not a question. What do your people, he said carefully, call a being who acts from obligation to those they have no obligation to? I thought about Velthris. The feeling of seeing what was always there. We have a word. Thessal. It does not translate cleanly. Approximately a debt that did not exist until it was paid. We have a concept, he said. For an enemy who acts with honor. We have a formal designation for how that enemy is to be treated in the post-conflict period. A pause. It is very rarely invoked. The designation assumes that the honorable actor was an enemy. And, if they were not an enemy? He was quiet. They were not our enemy, I said. No, he agreed. They were not anyone's ally either. Formally. No. They were just on the roads, I said. Using the roads. He turned to look at me. The ocular configuration I didn't have a reference for. I decided, going to have to add it to my classification table. I needed a label for it. Provisionally, I filed it under the expression of a being in the process of revising a foundational assumption about the universe. I am going to need, he said, a very long time to think about what I have learned today. Yes, I said. So am I. From inside the cabin, we could hear Okafor moving around. The sound of data being compiled. The small, practical sounds of someone doing the next necessary thing. Somewhere outside the hull, the war had been over for 18 hours. I did not yet know what it had cost, in total. I was not sure I had the right unit of measurement for that accounting. But, I was starting to understand what had been running alongside it. The archive was 4.7 teraflops of data. I am noting the size because I want you to understand the scale of the thing, which is not the scale of military intelligence or diplomatic record-keeping. It is the scale of something that was maintained the way a person maintains a personal accounting of their own life, with the obsessive completeness of someone who needed to be able to look at the full picture at any time, to hold it all, to ensure that nothing slipped into convenient forgetting. Every relay log. Every medical transit record. Every interdiction operation, timestamped and cross-referenced to the relevant engagement reports from both sides. Every name, the 7 dead, the 19,000 moved, the 42 detained officers tracked through the detention review process, the Harath facility population before and after the supply disruptions, the named individuals aboard each convoy that had been redirected. Names. That was the thing I was not prepared for. Databases at this scale, military records, casualty assessments, logistical manifests, they do not carry names. They carry numbers and designations and unit identifiers. The abstraction is functional. It is also, I now understood, protective in a way I had not previously considered protective. It shields the person looking at the data from the weight of the data. Okafor's archive was full of names. Every wounded individual moved by the medical team had a record. Species, age estimate, injury classification, origin unit, receiving facility, outcome. Outcome, recovered, ongoing care, deceased. The deceased had a second notation, date of death, cause, whether any next of kin notification had been possible through the humanitarian network. I sat with that for a long time. Whether any next of kin notification had been possible. This was not a military database. Militaries do not track that. Militaries track operational outcomes. Someone had built a database that tracked whether the families of the people who died in their care had been told. 14,231 recovered. 4,109 ongoing care. 18 deceased in transit. They had the names of the 18. I worked through the night. Drathian slept. Krethdi have a different relationship with rest than Bahari, and he had apparently decided that he needed to process what he had learned through unconsciousness rather than continued data analysis, which I found alien but not unreasonable. I did not sleep. I don't mean that heroically. I mean that I had 4.7 teraflops of data and my particular neurological configuration makes deep processing more effective than rest when there is a sufficiently large and unresolved index to work through. My people call this Sevrath, which does not translate neatly but points at something like the condition of a mind that cannot disengage from an incomplete account. By the third hour, I had mapped the full operational structure. It was not Okafor alone. She was a coordinator, the person who had built and maintained the relay network, who had managed the cargo cover identities, who had maintained the operational archive. But, the broader effort involved 43 individuals across 7 species, all operating through existing humanitarian and commercial frameworks, none of them in any official intelligence or military capacity. Freight operators. Aid workers. A xenobiologist who had been in the region for pre-war research and had never left. 2 journalists who had, by all apparent evidence, stopped filing articles and started filing logistics reports that were purely for internal use. A retired Concordat navigation officer I did not recognize by name but whose file notation read recalled from retirement, volunteer, navigation specialist, corridors Lev 4 through Lev 9. I checked the Concordat personnel registry. She had retired 8 months before the war started. She had not been recalled officially. She had, according to the archive, simply shown up. 43 people, over 43 months. They had not set out to influence the outcome of the war. The archive made this very clear in the operational notes that Okafor had written at each major decision point, and there were a lot of operational notes, because whatever else she was, the person who had built this archive was meticulous in a way that I recognized as a cognitive style, the same way I recognized my own. She wrote to herself at each inflection point. Rationale. Expected outcome. Risk assessment. Ethical review. Ethical review. I found the first one in the records for the Harrath transport interdiction. 3 dense paragraphs, timestamped to 2 days before the first disruption operation. She had written, among other things, "We are not in a position to end this. We are not soldiers. We are not a government. We do not have the resources or the standing to stop the war or to take a side in it. What we have is the ability to be in the specific places where the worst things are happening and to do specific, small things that reduce the immediate scale of the harm. This is not enough. It will never be enough. But, the fact that it is not enough does not mean it is nothing. The 19 people in Facility 6 who will still be alive 6 months from now because we disrupted this convoy, those 19 people are not nothing." I read that passage 3 times. On the 4th pass, I noted my scent glands. They were doing the thing I had identified last night as not a stress response and still didn't have a category for. The 19 people are not nothing. I looked at the facility records she had attached. The population projection she had run, based on deteriorating supply levels, based on mortality rates from comparable facilities in the region. The pre-disruption projection, 47 deaths in the following 6 months. The post-disruption projection, with reduced operational tempo, 23. She had attached a follow-up note, filed 8 months later. Actual mortality, 19. Better than projected. Supply disruption impact lasted longer than estimated. Noting for future operational planning. 19. Not 47. She had gone back and checked. Okafor was awake before I finished. I heard her in the galley unit before I saw her, the sounds of human morning routine, which I had been informed was a significant ritual for the species and, which, in practice, seemed to involve a lot of liquid consumption and a specific kind of silence that was not the absence of activity but the presence of a person not yet ready to engage with the day. She brought me the warm amber liquid. I had not tried it the night before. I tried it now. It was not unpleasant. Sweet, with a faint metallic undertone that probably meant nothing to her metabolism and that my Vihari biochemistry flagged as a minor irritant but not a danger. I kept drinking it because putting it down felt wrong, for a reason I did not analyze. "The ethical reviews," I said. She sat down across from me with her own cup. "You found those. You wrote one at every major decision point." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about this. "Because I needed to. Because I needed to be able to look at what I was doing and be able to defend it to myself. Not to an authority. To myself." A pause. I wasn't always sure I was right. Some of the calls were not clean. There were times when doing the thing that helped people here caused a problem over there. Trade-offs I couldn't fully calculate. The convoy disruption in month 40, I said. The collective resupply to Sector 9. You disrupted it. But, the collective defensive line in Sector 9 failed 3 weeks later and there were significant casualties. Yes. Her voice was flat again. I know. I have that in the archive too. A pause. I made the call based on the information I had at the time, which was that the resupply was feeding an offensive operation. It turned out it was mixed. The same shipment feeding an offensive was also feeding the garrison. I didn't know that. I should have known it. A long pause. That one is in the review as an error. I labeled it as an error. She said it simply. No deflection. No explanation. I found the review in the archive. It was filed exactly as she had described. 3 paragraphs. Error. Cause, insufficient intelligence on composition of resupply target. Correction, changed verification protocol for all subsequent convoy operations. And, then, at the bottom, a single line, the names of the Sector 9 casualties are appended. I am keeping them. I looked at the appended list. There were names. Long list. Both sides of the conflict, because when the defensive line failed, both the defenders and the assault force had taken losses in the chaos. She was keeping the names of people whose deaths she believed she had contributed to, however, indirectly, however, unknowingly. She had filed the review herself. To herself. For herself. I sat with this for a long time. You never told anyone, I said. What? What you were doing. The group of you, 43 people. No press releases. No reports to any government. No appeals for recognition or support. For 43 months, you did this and told no one. We told each other. Why not anyone else? She turned her cup in her hands. The specific motion of a person who has thought about an answer many times and is deciding which version to give. Partly operational security. If anyone had known, officially, any government, any intelligence service, we would have become an asset. Or a liability. Either way, we'd stop being able to do what we were doing and start being part of someone's political calculation. And the work mattered more than she stopped. Tried again. The work was more important than getting credit for it. And the other part? A pause. Because people would have wanted us to pick a side, she said. And we couldn't. We weren't going to. And explaining that to a collective diplomat or a Dominion intelligence officer or anyone would have been a conversation that went nowhere good. I thought about how that conversation would have gone. I could model it with some confidence, having spent my career in rooms full of beings who thought in terms of alliances and leverage and strategic interest. You were in a position to help us, and you helped them as well? Why? What do you want? What are you actually doing? They would have assumed an agenda, I said. Yes. Because every species in this war had one. Yes. Except you. She looked at her cup. We had an agenda. It was just not the kind anyone expected. Drathian woke up during the morning and ate the last of his ration pack without reactivating the smell, which I appreciated. He read the sections of the archive I had flagged without comment for an hour, then looked up. The Dominion officers, he said. The 40. The ones who were detained. What about them? The 12 who were released quickly, how was the review process accelerated? Okafor had been checking her vessel's navigation logs and looked up. I had a contact at the Dominion Administrative Tribunal. A junior clerk. We'd moved his family out of a contested region early in the war. The family asked him to return the favor when we needed documents expedited. A pause. He didn't know what we were. He thought he was repaying a personal debt. Drathian processed this. The remaining 28. The ones who took longer. Less access. Different detention facility with a more closed review process. We couldn't get traction until the collective's counterintelligence directorate started cross-examining their own original evidence and found the inconsistencies themselves. That took time. She paused. 8 months for the last group. Their names are in the archive. Yes. All 40. Yes. Drathian was quiet for a very long time. His 4 ocular clusters were focused on the middle distance, the Krethdi posture of processing something that does not fit into existing categories. I will need, he said slowly, to verify which of those 40 individuals are still in the Dominion's military apparatus. There may be outstanding records that reflect the detention. Career records. Commendation histories with gaps. He said it carefully. Precisely. The way a Krethdi intelligence officer says something that is not quite an offer and not quite a statement. The way such an officer leaves room for something to be accepted without it having to be explicitly given. I watched Okafor process this. That would be useful information, she said, equally precisely. I imagine it would. He looked at his secondary limbs. Stilled them deliberately. I am not in the position to make official commitments. This is not an official conversation. I understand. Unofficially, there are review mechanisms within the Dominion administrative framework that can be activated by someone with appropriate standing without drawing external attention. That would be appreciated. I would need the full list, which is in the archive. Yes. To which I have now been given access. Yes. He nodded, once. The Krethdi single nod that I had learned, over the past several hours, to recognize as the gesture of a being finalizing an internal decision. Then, I will see what can be done, he said. I filed my preliminary report to the Ceasefire Monitoring Committee at what my terminal labeled the end of the first full day of peace. It was 14 pages. That was shorter than my usual preliminary reports. I tend toward completeness, which my supervisors described charitably as thoroughness and, less charitably, as an inability to summarize. This one was deliberately brief, because the most important decisions in it were not technical and, I had learned, over the years, that brevity in sensitive characterizations is a form of precision. The section on the human transmission from Lev 9 occupied 2 paragraphs. It characterized the transmission as an administrative clarification request from a neutral party commercial operator regarding the scope of the ceasefire agreement's applicability to civilian corridor access. Standard query, common in the immediate post-ceasefire period. No indicators of prior involvement in combatant operations. Recommended action, confirm ceasefire applicability, file routine clearance for continued civilian freight operations. I read it back once. I had not lied. I had characterized accurately, selecting which facts to foreground and which to leave in a larger report that I had filed separately, under a different classification, accessible to senior committee members who would need to make eventual decisions about how the full picture was handled. That report, the full index, with the archive cross-referenced, was there. It was on record. It was available to anyone who needed to look at it. I had simply made it unlikely that anyone would look at it in the immediate term, when the ceasefire was fragile and the political landscape was still rearranging, and what the situation did not need was an incident. I filed the preliminary report. Then, I sat at my desk for a while. Drathian had already departed for his transit back to Dominion Administrative Headquarters, with the archive section I had cleared for transfer and a list of 40 names. He had, before leaving, done something I had never seen a Krethdi do with a monitoring committee officer. He had stopped in the corridor outside the shuttle dock and turned back to look at me with 2 of his 4 ocular clusters, the other 2 still tracking the departure bay. The Bahari have a concept, he had said, for a debt that did not exist until it was paid. Thessal, I had said. Yes. A pause. Does it, in your culture, imply an obligation to the one who paid it? Or does it rest with the one who received the payment? I had thought about this carefully. In older usage, it rests with the debt itself. The obligation belongs to the act. He had nodded again, that single, finalizing nod. Then, perhaps, he had said, the Dominion has a Thessal. that it will take some time to name. And, then, he had gone. I was still at my desk when Okafor came to find me. I had stayed at Lev 9 longer than necessary. Transit window for my return to the monitoring station wasn't for another 6 hours, and I had the kind of report reviewing work that can be done anywhere, so I had stayed. I told myself this was efficiency. I do not think it was efficiency. She found me in the depot's administrative annex, which was the least pleasant room in the facility. Fluorescent spectrum lighting, 2 broken air circulators, furniture that had been selected entirely on the basis of being cheap, and she sat across from me without asking and set something on the table. It was a small square of processed food that smelled sweet and slightly chemical. Human. The Lev 9 depot had a small commissary that stocked human provisions for the corridor traffic. You haven't eaten since yesterday, she said. I eat infrequently when I'm processing. You've been processing for 28 hours. That is accurate. She pushed the food toward me. I looked at it. I was aware that I was performing the behavioral sequence my species uses when presented with an unexpected social gesture, which involves a pause and a calculation of the gesture's intent, except that the calculation was going unusually slowly because I was tired and because something in the past 28 hours had been adjusting the calibration I used for those calculations. The preliminary report, she said. Did you file it? Yes. And it will not create an incident. Not in the immediate term. I paused. The fuller record exists. Eventually, when the ceasefire stabilizes and there's appetite for the history of what happened, someone will look at it. This is not something that disappears from the record. I know. She said it without tension. Without relief, either. Like someone who had already made their peace with being found, eventually, and was now simply living in the afterward. That's fine. That's what should happen. You're not concerned about what that looks like, politically. I'm concerned about a lot of things. She looked at her hands, the habit she had, I had noticed, of looking at her hands when she was holding something that was too large to hold in a single look. What it looks like politically, no. That was always going to be what it was. What mattered was doing it while it could still matter. I looked at the food she had brought me. I picked it up. I ate it. It was too sweet and faintly chemical and perfectly edible, and I did not taste it because I was thinking about something she had said the previous day. The 19 people are not nothing. How many people, I said, knew you were doing this? Outside the 43. No one. At the time. Now. She smiled, the small, tired smile again. Now there are 2 Concordat monitoring officers and 1 Kreftai intelligence officer who know. And, whatever they do with it. And, you think that is acceptable? I think it is what it is. She paused. What are you going to do with it? I thought about this. I thought about 11 anomalies that had turned into 43 names and 19,000 wounded and 7 dead and 40 officers in wrongful detention and a database full of next of kin notifications and a single line, those 19 people are not nothing. I thought about Velthris, the pattern that was always there. I thought about the fact that I had, at some point in the last 28 hours, stopped being a monitoring committee bureaucrat doing a routine clearance review and started being something I did not have a good professional category for. I don't know yet, I said. I will need to think about it for some time. She nodded. She seemed to accept this as a complete answer. I was not sure it was a complete answer. I was not sure what a complete answer looked like from here. Where do you go now? I asked. Back through the corridor. We have cargo to move. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without weight, without performance. The war generated a lot of displaced goods. Medical supplies, relief materials, reconstruction equipment. The corridors that were closed are opening. There's work. Freight work. Freight work. She stood. The roads are still there. Still need running. She said it like it was nothing. Like it was the only possible thing. I sat at my desk in the administrative annex with its broken air circulators and its fluorescent lighting, and I watched her go. I thought about 43 months of a war that 12 billion beings died in. I thought about 43 people on the roads through that war, running the routes that no one was watching, keeping a database that held every name, writing ethical reviews to themselves at 2 a.m. about calls that weren't clean. I thought about the fact that they had never needed anyone to know. I thought about the fact that they had not stopped. I thought about the word my grandfather, long dead, a career archivist who had spent his life maintaining records that other people ignored, had used for the documents that survived when the institutions that created them didn't. He called them living records. He said that every document that survived outlasted its context and carried its meaning forward into time that didn't know what to do with it yet. Vel thris, I thought. Thes al. A debt that did not exist until it was paid. I opened a new document on my terminal. Not a monitoring report. Not an official filing. Something else, something I was going to have to figure out the category for as I wrote it. At the top, I wrote, what I found when the war ended. Then, I wrote, this is not an official account. I am releasing it because some of what I uncovered has started showing up in other reports, from other monitoring stations, from other wars I was not assigned to, and I think it is time that the conclave understood what was actually sharing the galaxy with them. Outside the annex's single viewport, the second consideration was detaching from the docking collar. I watched it clear the depot's docking ring, orient toward the corridor access, and move. Steadily. Without hurry. The way something moves that knows exactly where it is going and has been there before. I watched it until it was gone. Then, I went back to writing. Fleet Secondary Trelevas, Bahari Concordat Monitoring Division, signs off. Final notation, Personal Log VHC 7741 Moen. I have been a bureaucrat my entire career. I count things. I file things. I find discrepancies. Here is the discrepancy. The war had 12 billion casualties. The humans had 43 people and used the roads. I do not know what to do with that. I am going to spend a long time figuring it out. In the meantime, the records exist. The archive exists. The names are there. The 19 people are not nothing. Neither are the rest.